All right, class, we'll go ahead and get started today. As always, we'll look at what happened today in history. So it's February 23rd. So in 1945, the U.S. raised the flag over Iwo Jima. So has anyone seen the famous picture of the guys holding up the flag? Yeah?
Yep.
That happened today, back in 1945. So pretty important stuff. Does anyone anybody know what happened with that event specifically? Just briefly, not, you don't have to go in detail.
The actual photo was not the first time. It was like what's it called?
Reenactment?
Yeah, thanks.
Anybody else? No?
The U.S. took control of the island.
Awesome. And then another fun fact, the Tootsie Roll was invented back in 1896. So I don't know if you like Tootsie Rolls, I don't have any for you, but it was invented today. So what we're going to talk about today, obviously, the three main branches of government. So some objectives we have for this and some things that you should be thinking about as we go through this lecture today is one, identify the main roles of each branch of government. So there's three. Try to find the ways that they're different from each other, See how they're separated. What's important to each role? What are the responsibilities of each role? Our next objective is identify key positions in those roles. So that can include jobs, leaders, etc. And then lastly, I do have some examples of some actual members of each branch. So make sure you're jotting those down today. So by looking at this visual up on the screen here, it should give you a pretty clear idea. How many of you have heard about the three main branches of government? Or have you mainly heard about, have you heard of Congress? You've obviously heard of Congress. You've heard of the Senate or the Cabinet. Those itself might seem like different branches of government, but really, we're just grouping them within three. So we'll go ahead and get started. I have a sheet that you can follow around with. It has that same visual that's up on the screen. So if you need a closer look, on the first page, there's some key terminology. If there's some terms that you don't quite understand as I'm going through the lecture. And then on the second page, you have each branch listed out individually with some fill in the blanks. So what I want you to do is, pay attention to the lecture. It should be fairly obvious what you should be filling in. And it should just also help you give you a better idea of each branch of government. So we'll go ahead and get started. So we're going to start with the executive branch. Executive in itself, what might one infer this branch might entail?
The White House.
The White House, good.
Making executive decisions.
Executive decisions, exactly. That should be a dead giveaway with the word executive. So this branch is responsible for, signing legislation, and the leader of this branch is the President of the United States. And so he has the power to either sign into law legislation from Congress, as I mentioned, or he can veto it, which means to deny it, basically reject it. And so this branch of government's main responsibility is to enforce and implement laws set by Congress. Also, another key factor that this branch of government deals with is diplomacy. Can anyone tell me what diplomacy is without looking at their sheet?
Negotiating.
Correct. What else goes in with that? Negotiating with what? If you're the President of the United States, what would diplomacy look like for the President?
Like foreign relations?
Yes, exactly. Foreign relations is a big word for that. Okay. So some examples of the executive branch would include the President of the United States. He's the leader of the executive branch. It also includes members like the Vice President, the Executive Office of the President, and the President's Cabinet. Does anyone know what the Cabinet is?
The advice?
Close, yeah. You're on the right track. Anybody else? The Presidential Cabinet? No? Alright, so it's a group of advisors for the President. And have you ever heard of, the Secretary of Defense or Secretary of State? They're the President's closest, advisors to give him advice on certain areas of government. So like, Secretary of Defense or whatnot. And so some real life examples of the executive branch are obviously Barack Obama, POTUS, I threw that in there for you social media kids.
Can you explain what POTUS is?
President of the United States.
Oh, thanks.
It's Barack Obama's Twitter handle, actually.
Oh, okay.
And then Joe Biden, who is the vice president right now, and John Kerry is the Secretary of State. So kind of an example of the cabinet members. So all of these members are included in the executive branch. This branch of government is in charge of making all the executive decisions. So moving on to the legislative branch, big old word there is Congress. Does anybody know both sides of Congress?
House and Senate.
Exactly. So the legislative branch is responsible for making laws and writing the language to these laws. As I said it's also called Congress. They vote on laws to be passed up to the executive branch on which they're approved or not. Powers of the legislative branch can include, declaring war, confirming a president, appointments, and investigating power. Besides like making meeting appointments, do you guys know the political definition of appointments? What that would entail? If you're going to appoint somebody, what would that mean?
You're gonna basically give them a duty to carry out.
Exactly. You're going to assign them a role. So that's what appointment means in referring to government or politics. So some examples of the legislative branch. Brian touched on it. The Congress is made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate. I forgot to mention. Who recognizes this guy up in the corner?
I'm just a boo.
Yep, we've all seen it. I would show it, but you guys have all seen it a million times. Maybe if we have time at the end, we can watch it. I thought it was humorous. So yeah, the Congress is made up of the House of Representatives and Senators, and those, all those guys, they work together to write up those bills. It's some, tricky and it's some complicated stuff that they go through, but ultimately they create all the laws that are in effect today, and then it goes up to the president, and the president can either approve it or veto it. Some other positions in the legislative branch include, the Speaker of the House or the Majority of Whip. Who here has watched House of Cards? Nobody? Really?
Like one episode?
I know it has Machiavellian principles.
Brian? Never watched House of Cards? Alright, well, we'll move on then. Some real world examples of people in the legislative branch include, John Barrasso, who is a Wyoming senator, Steve Scalise, which is the House Majority Whip right now, and Jeff Fortenberry, who is a congressman from my home state of Nebraska. Yeah, question?
What's a majority whip?
Majority Whip, he is in charge of collecting votes on an issue. He's basically in charge of both the House and the Senate and gathering enough votes to either pass a bill or go against it. And so I'm glad you mentioned that, because if you're interested in that, there's a research project that we'll be doing next week that you can keep in the back of your head. So hang on to that thought. And then lastly, we have the judicial branch. The judicial branch is responsible for evaluating and interpreting these laws. So in a way they're enforcing them, but they're making sure that justice is held up. They can decide whether a law is constitutional or not. Basically, they handle trials and court cases. A big part of the judicial branch is the Supreme Court. I'm sure you've all heard of it. It is the highest court level in the United States. Has 9 justices on that committee. So this includes the Supreme Court, as I said, and then just other federal courts across the country. So you have your state courts and your local courts. This is all included in that judicial branch. And so some examples include John G. Roberts Jr., who is the Chief Justice of the United States, Anthony Kennedy, also serves on the Supreme Court, and James Burke, who's the Chief Justice of Wyoming. So does everyone have a pretty good grasp on the three main branches of government? You have the executive branch, the legislative branch, and judicial branch. So if you have any questions right now, let me know if there's any confusion between the three.
What are the different levels of courts? So you have like the Chief Justice, and then like the Supreme Court, and then like the Chief Justice of Wyoming. So what are their roles?
It's a good question. So the Supreme Court is the highest level of courts in this country. So the Chief Justice, he's basically in charge of the Supreme Court. He won't mess with cases in like other federal courts, just on the Supreme Court, but he's basically in charge of the Supreme Court. And then you have the Chief Justices, or not the Associate Justices are just members on that court. And then same with like the Chief Justice of Wyoming. You know, Wyoming has the highest level of court, so James Burke is that highest level, and then you have associate justices that serve on that court. Yes, RJ.
What happens when a justice of the United States Supreme Court steps down or passes away?
Passes away? Another good question. And that you should keep that in the back of your head if you're interested as well. So basically, the president actually gets to appoint who is that next justice to serve on the court. So all three of these branches of government, they work hand in hand with each other. They're just separated by their duties and responsibilities. They all leverage off each other though. So wrapping it all up, here's another visual of those three branches. You know, you get the legislative branch with the state capitol, you get the executive branch with the White House, and the judicial branch, which has the Supreme Court. And then it moves on down the line where you have, you know, Congress, President, and the Supreme Court, and just kind of files in the you know, smaller members of those branches and what their duties are. So looking ahead, as I was telling you guys to keep those, you know, ideas in the back of your head, we're going to be working on a research project next week. And each of you will get to choose one of the main branches of government to research. And what you'll be doing is, you know, you'll be going in more depth of some of the processes that take place in those branches of government. So as Emma was saying, I'm just a bill. If she wants to go and look further in depth of the process of how a bill becomes a law, you will have the choice to do so. So more instructions will be given to you next week about that. So as you know, kind of your assessment, we're going to be doing an exit ticket. So I'm sure you've done that before. So just on a scratch piece of paper, you know, I want you to write your name on it, and then I want you to list each branch of government, and then give an example of, you know, one position, like one of the jobs associated with one of those branches of government, and one actual member of each branch of government. And then in 3 words or less for each branch, describe each branch of government in 3 words or less. Does that make sense? Good?